The grim story of the Hartwell family, 5 wives who all went insane the moment, still echoes through Millbrook's memory like a scream trapped in glass. The table was heavy with silverware and polite laughter when Margaret rose without a word, her chair scraping the floor in a sound far too loud for the room. She crossed the dining hall as if pulled by an invisible hand, stopped before the tall mirror, and began to speak, not to her guests, not to her husband, but to the woman staring back at her from the polished surface. Her hands cut through the air in sharp, furious motions, her lips moving in heated argument, her eyes blazing as though the reflection had accused her of something unforgivable. No one dared interrupt. They watched, frozen, as if the mirror itself had swallowed the room. That night would become only one fragment of a far larger horror. Across a quarter century in 19th century Pennsylvania, 5 women entered the same mansion as brides, radiant and sound of mind, and each emerged broken. Each marriage followed the same terrible rhythm. Months of happiness, weeks of unease, then a collapse so complete it erased the woman they had once been. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not speak of bad fortune or inherited madness. It whispered of intention, of desire, of a man who understood exactly how to fracture a human mind, and did so again and again, hidden behind respectability and wealth. Millbrook sat in a valley carved by coal and ambition, its air thick with smoke and promise. Factories roared along the riverbanks, and fortunes rose as quickly as chimneys. Into this town came Jeremiah Hartwell, a man who seemed shaped by the age itself. He had not been born into privilege. He had learned early that mercy was a luxury and success demanded hunger. His iron works fed the railroads pushing west, and his name soon carried weight enough to bend conversations when he entered a room. The mansion he built on Beacon Hill was less a home than a declaration. Stone, marble, endless corridors, and a master suite so vast it felt like a house within a house. The bedroom dominated the east wing, its windows swallowing the horizon, its walls dressed in imported elegance. People admired it openly, yet something about that space unsettled those who lingered too long. Servants complained of whispers carried by drafts. Guests said the mirrors seemed too clear, too attentive, as if they remembered faces. Jeremiah himself was impossible to ignore. Tall, silver-haired before his time, his gaze steady and unsettlingly intimate. He listened in a way that made people feel exposed and chosen all at once. Mothers trusted him. Daughters dreamed of him. When he married Margaret Dunlap, the town celebrated with bells and ink-stained praise. She was young, clever, and alive with curiosity, and she walked into the mansion believing she had claimed a future of comfort and admiration. The house began its work quietly. Margaret's laughter softened. Her attention wandered. She spoke of sounds that others could not hear, of rooms that seemed to shift their mood like breathing creatures. She excused it all with fragile humor, insisting that old buildings had personalities, that one simply needed to listen. Her sisters saw the fear beneath the smiles, the way Margaret flinched at doorways, the way she paused as though waiting for permission to speak. Soon the bedroom became a prison disguised as sanctuary. Margaret refused to sleep elsewhere, insisting that only there did the house feel correct. She stood before the windows for hours, not watching the town below, but studying herself in the glass, as if searching for proof that she was still real. Servants whispered that she argued with her own reflection, that she begged it to stop watching her. Jeremiah never raised his voice. He never displayed cruelty. He adjusted routines, changed lighting, introduced subtle deprivations masked as care. Isolation wrapped itself around Margaret like velvet. When she finally shattered at the dinner party, the town mourned her illness and praised Jeremiah's patience. She was removed quietly, her name spoken with pity, her fate blamed on a fragile female constitution. Then another wife arrived, and another, each intelligent, each strong, each reduced to the same hollow gaze, the same fixation on mirrors, the same terror of leaving the master suite. Patterns emerged only in hindsight. The mirrors were always present, the bedroom always central, the man always attentive, always blameless. By the time the fifth wife fell into incoherence, whispers hardened into fear. Investigations uncovered journals hidden behind walls, notes detailing controlled isolation, sensory manipulation, and psychological pressure applied with scientific precision. The mansion was not haunted by spirits, but by intention. Jeremiah Hartwell had been conducting an experiment, refining a method of domination that erased identity without leaving bruises. When authorities finally intervened, the house stood silent, its mirrors dark, its windows blind. Jeremiah vanished from public life, leaving behind 5 women whose minds had been carefully dismantled in the name of control. Millbrook tried to forget, but some nights, when the wind slides down Beacon Hill, people swear they hear arguing voices drifting from empty rooms, and if you listen closely, you might hear a woman demanding answers from the glass. And a house that never learned how to stop watching. Her laughter shattered the room, thin and shrill, nothing like the warm sound guests remembered. It rose and fell at strange intervals, as if answering a joke no one else could hear. She leaned closer to the mirror, her face inches from the glass, and asked again why she looked so tired. Thomas Peyton would later write that the question chilled him more than her tone, because she asked it with expectation, pausing each time as though the reflection required time to respond. The most disturbing detail was not the laughter, nor the questions, but the silence that followed them. Margaret would wait, head tilted, eyes unfocused, listening, truly listening. When Jeremiah Hartwell approached her gently, placing a hand on her arm, she recoiled as if struck. Her voice hardened. She said she was not finished speaking yet, not finished negotiating, not finished learning. The guests departed soon after, their polite excuses masking a growing dread. The house exhaled as the doors closed, and the mirrors kept their counsel. Later that night, long after the servants believed the household asleep, Sarah Quinn climbed the stairs toward the master suite, drawn by a sound like paper tearing in careful rhythm. She found Margaret standing naked beneath the dim glow of a single lamp, her skin pale against the dark floor, her expression calm beyond reason. With methodical patience, she was peeling away the French wallpaper, strip after strip, exposing the bare bones of the room. When Sarah gasped, Margaret turned and smiled serenely, explaining that she needed to see what was underneath. She spoke as though it were obvious, as though the walls had been hiding something vital all along. When the last piece fell, nothing was revealed. Only plaster, only wood, only the ordinary skeleton of a well-built mansion. Yet Margaret nodded with deep satisfaction, as if a long argument had finally been settled. She thanked Sarah for coming, then returned to studying the exposed wall, her fingers resting against it like a listener pressed to a door. By morning, the family physician stood at her bedside, puzzled and uneasy. He found no weakness in her limbs, no fever, no visible injury. Her body was young and strong. Her mind, however, wandered through corridors no one else could enter. He wrote of exhaustion, of melancholy, of nervous collapse, but lingered on a detail that disturbed him greatly. Margaret spoke of her reflection as if it were another person entirely. Not a delusion born of confusion, but a certainty. She believed this other self knew things about the house, things about what had happened there long before she arrived. Within days, the fixation grew. Mirrors became her destination. She drifted from room to room, pausing at every reflective surface, whispering questions, nodding at unheard answers. When cloths were placed over the glass, she erupted in terror and rage, clawing at the fabric until her fingers split and bled. She screamed that they were silencing her family, that they were cutting her off from the truth. Then came the night the house seemed to hold its breath. Margaret moved through the mansion with unnatural focus, gathering every mirror, every polished tray, every reflective fragment she could find. She dragged them into the master bedroom, arranging them in a complex, deliberate pattern that no one dared interrupt. The servants watched from the hallway as she worked, her lips moving constantly, murmuring calculations and promises. When the door finally closed, voices rose within. Not one voice, many. The housekeeper would later say it sounded like a meeting held just beyond the edge of understanding. By morning, Margaret no longer recognized her husband. She did not recognize her sister. She did not recognize her own name unless it echoed back at her from glass. The reflections, she said, were her real family now. They had always been there, waiting for her to listen properly. The decision to send her away was made with solemn regret and public sympathy. On a grey autumn morning, leaves scraping along the drive like restless hands, Margaret was led into a closed carriage. She turned back once, smiling faintly, and told the others she would return soon. She waved at the windows. She waved at the mirrors. She never came home. Years passed. The town whispered, then grew bored, then found new tragedies to discuss. Margaret lived out her days behind institutional walls, endlessly searching for reflective surfaces, speaking softly to herself until even the doctors learned not to interrupt. Her death was recorded with clinical detachment, her burial quiet and restrained. Beloved wife at peace, the stone raid. The words felt like an apology. Jeremiah Hartwell retreated from society, draping his grief in respectability. The master bedroom was sealed, its contents shrouded in white, as if mourning itself had been preserved inside. He moved to a smaller room and spent his nights surrounded by books and correspondence. Devouring medical theories and philosophical speculation, he spoke of understanding, of reason, of the science behind suffering. Those who saw him believed him sincere, a man broken by loss. Yet something in him sharpened after Margaret's death. His attention to detail became relentless. Mirrors in his office were cleaned twice daily, inspected for smudges or distortions. He corrected servants who placed them at improper angles. He lingered before them longer than necessary, studying his own reflection with an intensity that unsettled even his closest associates. Those who worked late claimed they heard him murmuring questions into the glass, pausing afterward as if waiting. Millbrook believed the story ended, that the house on Beacon Hill had consumed its tragedy and fallen silent. But houses remember. Mirrors remember more, and deep within those polished surfaces, something had learned exactly how to speak, how to wait, and how to be heard. He began to glance at his own image with unsettling regularity, even in the midst of serious discussions, though he needed reassurance that the man reflected back still appeared acceptable, still convincingly human. Business partners noticed the habit but dismissed it as grief lingering too long. What unsettled them more was how Jeremiah Hartwell spoke of marriage once again. There was no warmth in his tone, no reverence for companionship. He discussed it the way one might discuss acquiring land or machinery. He spoke of suitability, endurance, balance of temperament. He drafted criteria, weighed strengths, evaluated weaknesses, and referred to these calculations as compatibility assessments. Love, if it existed at all, was never mentioned. It was during this deliberate season of selection that he encountered Elena Rodriguez, the daughter of a Spanish merchant whose trade connections had begun weaving through Pittsburgh's expanding industrial veins. Elena was young, luminous, and sharp-minded. But what truly caught Hartwell's attention was her composure. In conversation, she demonstrated a clarity and steadiness he found deeply reassuring. She listened without intimidation, questioned without fear, and met his gaze without flinching. To him, she represented resilience. To Millbrook society, she appeared a bright promise after long shadow. Their engagement startled the town. Many had assumed Hartwell's grief had sealed him off permanently. Instead, he seemed revived, almost polished anew. The charm returned, refined and controlled. Elena appeared sincerely delighted, speaking with enthusiasm about the life awaiting her atop Beacon Hill. When they married, the ceremony was tasteful and restrained, lacking the spectacle of his first wedding but carrying an air of confident renewal. Soon after Elena crossed the threshold of the mansion, Jeremiah made a choice that would later echo with dread. He unsealed the master suite. The room was stripped of its shrouds and reborn with fresh elegance. New wallpaper, new furnishings, and mirrors. Many mirrors. They lined walls, adorned vanities, and caught light from every angle, multiplying the space until it felt endless. Elena adored the room. She took pride in it, guiding guests through the suite, delighted by how the mirrors scattered sunlight like living things. Each morning and evening, she sat before the vanity, brushing her dark hair in long, meditative strokes, speaking cheerfully with her maid about plans and duties. The mirror reflected serenity. For a time, the house appeared satisfied. Months passed in apparent harmony. Elena flourished. She charmed visitors, managed the household with confidence, and hosted gatherings that restored Hartwell's standing among his peers. Unlike Margaret, she did not withdraw. She expanded. She filled rooms with laughter and purpose. The mansion seemed almost lighter in her presence, but winter crept in quietly, and with it, subtle alterations that only the closest eyes detected. Elena lingered longer before the mirrors. Her brushing slowed. Her gaze shifted. She no longer looked directly at herself. She stared just beside her reflection, as though someone stood there, slightly out of view. Her maid, Maria Santos, noticed everything. Loyal and attentive, she recorded her observations in a private diary, page later discovered hidden away like a confession the house had swallowed. Maria wrote of mornings that stretched unnaturally long, of Elena sitting in silence, eyes fixed on an unseen companion. When Maria asked if she required assistance, Elena replied softly that she was speaking, that something important was being explained, and it required careful listening. By early spring, Elena openly acknowledged what she called conversation. She insisted these exchanges were not madness, not imagination, but dialogue. She stood before mirrors throughout the mansion, speaking politely, pausing often, nodding in understanding. Unlike Margaret's frantic confrontations, these interactions were calm, almost instructional. Elena described them as pleasant, informative. She told Maria that the mirror woman knew the house intimately, that she understood its rhythms, its secrets, its hidden spaces. She offered advice on managing servants, on maintaining harmony, on how to move through the mansion without disturbing what slept beneath its surfaces. Elena spoke of this guidance with gratitude, even admiration. When Dr. Henley was consulted once more, his concern deepened. In his private correspondence, he noted the resemblance to the previous tragedy, though he struggled to classify it. Elena was coherent, intelligent, physically well. Her speech remained precise, her memory intact, her social grace untouched. Only the mirrors claimed her devotion. The true shift came when Elena confided that the mirror woman was not alone. She claimed another presence lingered there. A woman from before, a warning left behind, trapped within reflective planes, reaching out to those who would listen. Elena believed the previous mistress of the house still existed, suspended between surfaces, unable to leave, compelled to speak. She said the mirrors were not objects. They were doors. Dr. Henley wrote with an ease that Elena's conviction was absolute yet strangely contained. There was no frenzy, no collapse. Only certainty. She managed the household flawlessly, hosted dinners with elegance, and spoke rationally on all subjects except one. The obsession did not spread. It narrowed, focused, concentrated like a blade. Jeremiah observed quietly. He asked careful questions. He listened without interruption. He never contradicted her. Instead, he watched the mirrors. At night, the house grew restless. Reflections seemed deeper. Hallways felt longer. Glass caught movements that could not be traced to bodies. Elena spent increasing hours in the master suite, her voice drifting softly through the doors, punctuated by long pauses filled with listening. The mansion did not resist her. It welcomed her attention, and somewhere within those endless reflections, something waited, patient and precise. Pleased to find another mind willing to listen without fear. Jeremiah's response to his second wife's unraveling revealed a transformation far more chilling than grief. Where once he had rushed for physicians and reassurances, now he chose distance masked as reason. He told himself he was being careful, methodical. He began to watch Elena the way a naturalist observes an unfamiliar species, recording habits, triggers, rhythms. His journals from this period no longer read like the confessions of a worried husband, but the notes of a man attempting to map a phenomenon he believed was repeating itself with purpose. He wrote that the similarities were impossible to ignore, yet the differences fascinated him even more. Both women had arrived whole. Both had slept beneath the same ceiling. Both had grown attentive to mirrors as if drawn by gravity. Both claimed to receive knowledge that could not be explained by chance. And yet Elena remained lucid where Margaret had fractured. This suggested, in his mind, not inherited weakness, but influence. Something in the environment, something embedded in the house itself. From that conclusion, his behavior shifted. He began what he privately termed observation trials. He noted which mirrors held Elena longest, which hours deepened her focus, which rooms sharpened her listening. He timed her conversations. He catalogued her words. He asked careful questions, never challenging her conclusions, only encouraging her to speak more precisely. In the margins of his notes, the language grew colder, sharper, as if curiosity was slowly replacing concern. Patterns emerged that unsettled even him. Elena's most intense encounters always occurred in the master bedroom, between the fall of daylight and the heavy silence of midnight. Always before the same vanity mirror, always following the same arc. Questions about the house. Answers about those who lived there before, hints of sealed spaces and truths meant to remain buried, and always, eventually, the subject of the first wife. Elena began to speak of Margaret not as a tragic figure, but as a witness silenced too soon. She said the mirror woman had shown her memories, not vision, that Margaret had discovered something forbidden and paid for it with her freedom. She insisted her predecessor had not lost her mind at all, but had been made to appear mad so her knowledge would be dismissed. The mirrors, Elena claimed, had preserved her voice, waiting for another woman willing to listen. By the height of summer, Elena no longer attempted to hide her dependence. She refused invitations unless mirrors were present, claiming she needed guidance on how to speak, what to reveal, what to withhold. In homes without reflective surfaces, she grew restless and pale, distracted by the absence of counsel. She would leave early, returning to Beacon Hill with visible relief, as though she had been holding her breath all evening. The crisis arrived on a night when the heat pressed against the mansion like a living weight. Jeremiah found Elena seated before the vanity, motionless. No murmurs, no gestures, just stillness. Her eyes were wet, fixed on her reflection with an expression that carried both sorrow and resolve. Without turning, she told him that the truth had finally been revealed, about the house, about him, about why Margaret had vanished behind locked doors and whispered diagnoses. She spoke calmly. That was the most terrifying part. She said the mirror woman had shown her what lay within the walls. Passages disguised as structure. Rooms sealed behind elegance. Spaces where women had been kept, watched, studied. She said the house remembered everything and shared those memories selectively, revealing them only to those who slept in the master suite long enough to hear its voice. Jeremiah wrote later that Elena's claims were elaborate, detailed, and deeply troubling. She described the mansion's construction with precision that startled him, pointing out angles and voids he had never publicly discussed. She spoke of hidden corridors connecting unused wings of mechanisms embedded in walls, of ways the house itself could observe its occupants. And then she accused him directly. She said the medicine he offered for her headaches was not what he claimed. She said the mirrors had shown her its true effect, how it blurred perception, how it encouraged visions, how it turned coherence into something easily dismissed as madness. She told him this was how the truth was buried, how women were discredited before they could be believed. Jeremiah did not argue. He listened, he recorded, and by morning he had made his decision. He framed her revelations as delusions, her certainty as evidence of collapse. He spoke to the physician with urgency, emphasizing paranoia, fixation, and conspiracy. He described her belief in hidden chambers and criminal acts as proof of a complete break from reality. The parallels to the previous case were too strong, he said, the risk too great. Dr. Henley agreed. He noted the structured nature of Elena's beliefs, the way her delusions formed a coherent system rather than scattered confusion. He warned that such clarity could be dangerous, that conviction often hardened just before complete withdrawal. He recommended immediate intervention before her fantasies consumed her entirely. Elena sensed the shift. She began to whisper to the mirrors with urgency, as if time was slipping away. She begged them to remember her, to keep speaking after she was gone, to warn whoever came next. The house listened. The glass absorbed every word. When the decision was announced, it came cloaked in concern and necessity. Another tragedy, another unfortunate decline, another woman escorted away while the town shook its head and whispered about fragile minds and overwhelming responsibility. As the carriage carried Elena from Beacon Hill, The mirrors in the master suite reflected an empty room, but emptiness is not absence. It is merely space waiting to be filled again. Jeremiah stood alone that night, studying his own reflection, searching for reassurance. The house remained silent, patient, certain that sooner or later another woman would cross its threshold. And when she did, the mirrors would be ready. The warning had already been written. If no intervention came, Elena would descend into the same violent unraveling that had marked the final days of the first mistress of Beacon Hill. Yet Elena refused to fade quietly into locked corridors and polite diagnoses. Instead, something hardened inside her. Fear transformed into purpose. She announced that she would uncover the truth herself, and she began what she calmly called her investigation. She moved through the mansion like someone following a map only she could see. Her hands traced walls, her ears pressed against paneling. She tapped, listened, paused, then smiled with a confidence that unsettled everyone who watched. She recruited Maria and a handful of servants, speaking to them not as conspirators but as witnesses to something larger than fear. She told them the house was layered with lies, and that lies always leave seams. At first, the search felt absurd. Tapping wood, sliding fingers along moldings, testing shelves and wardrobes that had stood untouched for years. Then, behind a heavy wardrobe in the master bedroom, Maria heard a sound that did not belong. A hollow echo. The air shifted. When pressure was applied to a narrow section of wall, it yielded, swinging inward as though it had been waiting for that exact touch. Behind it lay a passage no wider than a coffin's embrace. Dust coated its floor, undisturbed, yet the walls bore marks of repeated contact. The corridor stretched between rooms, threading through the mansion like a hidden vein. Small openings punctured the walls at careful angles. When Elena leaned close, she understood at once. These were not floors, they were eyes. She laughed then, softly, triumphantly. The mirror woman had spoken the truth. The passages existed, and if this was true, then nothing else could be dismissed. The servants recoiled in horror. The idea that bedrooms had once been observed from within the walls spread through the household like a sickness. But Jeremiah's reaction was different. His journals from those days reveal a man losing ground beneath his own feet. He wrote of shock, of disbelief, of the impossible reality that his home contained features he could not explain. He insisted that the previous owner had never mentioned such structures. He claimed ignorance, but even as he wrote these defenses, his words grew strained. Elena's interpretations, he insisted, were irrational. She saw persecution everywhere. She believed the house itself was complicit. Yet the facts remained raw and undeniable. The passages were real. Rumors escaped the mansion and raced through Millbrook. Questions followed. Why had Jeremiah never known? Why had both wives become obsessed with the same room, the same mirrors, the same whispers? The coincidence began to rot from the inside. Then Don Carlos Rodriguez arrived. He came without warning, his presence heavy with authority earned through years of measured skepticism. He did not arrive seeking comfort. He arrived seeking answers. When he saw his daughter, he did not see a shattered woman. He saw focus, resolve, fear held in check by reason, and that frightened him more than hysteria ever could. That evening he confronted Jeremiah. He spoke plainly. His daughter claimed crimes had been committed within those walls. She claimed her mind was being altered through substances administered without her consent. These were not accusations to be dismissed with sighs and medical jargon. These were claims that demanded proof or confession. The confrontation unfolded in the library, a room stripped of reflection, deliberately chosen. Elena insisted on attending. When she realized there was no mirror present, panic flared across her face. She demanded a hand mirror be brought at once. She said she could not speak without guidance, that the mirror woman had protected her, just as she had tried to protect the one who came before. Don Carlos did not scoff. He watched. He listened. And then he asked questions no one else had thought to ask. He asked Elena to describe what the mirror woman had revealed about the house's past. Not impressions, not feelings, details. Elena answered without hesitation. She described the original owner with unsettling precision. She spoke of architectural changes made decades earlier, of rooms sealed and reopened, of financial arrangements that predated her marriage. She spoke of men Jeremiah had never named to her, of investments he had never discussed. Jeremiah interrupted, attempting to dismiss her words as coincidence, guesswork. But the guesses did not falter. Elena continued, her voice steady. She recounted conversations that had taken place in that very library years before she had ever entered Millbrook. Discussions of money, of expansion, of methods. She repeated phrases word for word. Don Carlos felt the blood drain from his face. She said the mirror woman had seen everything, that the mirrors were not passive. They remembered, they listened, they collected truths left behind by those who believed themselves unseen. She said the house had been designed to observe, to learn, to control, and that women placed within the master suite were slowly taught to hear what the mirrors had stored. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jeremiah felt the weight of it closing in. His explanation sounded thin, even to his own ears. The house no longer felt obedient, it felt exposed. Elena held the hand mirror tightly now, her knuckles white. She said the mirror woman had warned her this moment would come. That truth, once uncovered, always demanded a price. She said others would follow her, and that the mirrors would speak to them too. Outside, the mansion creaked as the temperature dropped. Shadows shifted along the walls. In the hidden passages, dust stirred where no footsteps moved. The house had been opened, and once a house begins to speak, it does not forget who listened first. She spoke as if reciting from a ledger written in air, explaining that the mirrors did not merely reflect faces, they gathered lives. They watched every guest who crossed the threshold, every whispered confidence, every secret mistake, spoken under the illusion of privacy. The mirror woman, Elena said, knew of hidden accounts, of deals made in shadow, of the true reason Jeremiah Hartwell had chosen this particular mansion as his throne. As her words poured out, the room shifted from concern to dread. This was no longer a question of illness, it was the slow unveiling of intent. A pattern took shape with terrible clarity. The mansion had not been purchased for its beauty alone, but for its design. Its walls listened, its passages saw. Jeremiah's rise had been fed by knowledge stolen from those who trusted him, competitors, partners, friends, even family. And his marriages, Elena claimed, were never acts of love. They were masks, carefully arranged domestic scenes meant to shield a far darker machinery operating just beneath polite society. The tension thickened when Dr. Henley arrived, summoned by Jeremiah to restore order, to reduce the evening to diagnosis and confinement. But Don Carlos stood firm, his gaze sharp, his voice steady. He turned the physician's attention away from Elena and toward the pattern itself. He asked how two women, strangers to madness, could fracture in nearly identical ways after living in the same rooms. He asked whether coincidence alone could truly bear such weight. Dr. Henley hesitated. He spoke of stress, of isolation, of substances capable of altering perception while leaving the body intact. He admitted that exposure to certain compounds could create hallucinations, obsessions, false certainties. He spoke carefully, but the implication rang loud. If Elena's mind had been altered by design, then Margaret's fate was no tragedy, it was a method. The room seemed to contract around that realization. The air felt used, as though it remembered every lie spoken within it. Elena paced, restless now, pleading for a mirror. She said she needed to confirm details to ensure nothing was forgotten. When denied, she began to speak faster, listing rooms sealed behind false walls, compartments disguised as ornament, places where proof had been hidden for years. Jeremiah protested, insisting she could not know these things, but each detail landed with the weight of accuracy. Then she stopped, her eyes widened. She said the mirror woman had shown her where the truth slept. She led them upstairs, her steps steady, purposeful. In the master bedroom, she directed them to the massive wardrobe. Behind it, the hidden passage yawned open once more. But this time, her hand pressed farther, deeper. A concealed cavity revealed itself, and from it, they withdrew the evidence that would shatter every remaining doubt. By lamplight, Don Carlos examined the contents. Papers aged and meticulous, records kept with pride, a ledger bound in worn leather detailed years of surveillance, each entry cold and precise. Conversations overheard, secrets catalogued, futures manipulated before decisions were ever announced. Names familiar to Millbrook filled the pages, their private moments turned into leverage, but beneath the ledger lay something worse. Correspondence wrapped carefully against time connected Jeremiah to a physician whose work lived in secrecy. Letters spoke of treatments designed to fracture credibility without destroying function, substances administered slowly, subtly, masked as remedies. The goal was not madness but control. Women would remain articulate, capable, believable in every way except where it mattered most. Their truths would be dismissed as delusion. Their warnings would sound like fantasy. The writings praised the effectiveness of mirrors as anchors for obsession, exploiting vanity until it became fixation. Elena's headaches, Margaret's exhaustion, all had been fed the same poison measured with care. The medicine was never medicine. As the truth emerged, the mansion seemed to breathe. The mirrors caught lamplight and held it too long. The house, once silent, now felt crowded with memory. Elena stood very still, her voice quiet as she said the mirror woman had not lied. She had been preserving the truth, waiting for someone strong enough to hear it without breaking. Jeremiah said nothing. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, no longer obedient, no longer familiar. In that moment, the house no longer belonged to him. It had turned witness. The night did not end with closure. It ended with exposure. And as the shadows stretched along the walls, it became clear that the mansion on Beacon Hill had never been haunted by spirits. It had been haunted by knowledge. And knowledge, once uncovered, does not return quietly to the dark. What had been dismissed as fragile nerves now revealed itself as something far more deliberate, especially when weighed against the crushing solitude of the house and the suffocating awareness of being watched at every moment. Margaret Hartwell had not collapsed under the weight of chance or weakness. She had been carefully undone, slowly, quietly, method by method. The moment she stumbled upon proof of Jeremiah's hidden eyes and listening walls, her fate had been sealed. The change in her behavior, the restless nights, the fixation on reflections, were not symptoms of an unsteady mind, but the calculated results of substance introduced into her body with chilling precision. The mirrors became her tormentors because they were made to be, filled with visions meant to terrify her into silence. And when she tried to speak, when she tried to warn others, her words dissolved into mockery, labeled hysteria by those who could not imagine such evil wearing the face of a respectable husband. Yet even this was only the surface. Buried deeper among the recovered materials lay a final revelation, one that widened the horror until it eclipsed the walls themselves. Jeremiah Hartwell had not been content with spying on dinner guests and business rivals. The mansion was merely the heart of a sprawling, private intelligence enterprise. From this house, information flowed outward like poison through veins, reaching politicians, industrialists, judges, and financiers across Pennsylvania. He sold secrets the way others sold grain or steel. The hidden corridors were not crude peepholes, but arteries of a vast mechanism, connecting to concealed devices, copied documents, coded ledgers, and locked chambers where reputations were stored like currency. His marriages were never acts of affection. They were investments. Each wife served as a flawless hostess, moving effortlessly through drawing rooms and soirees, gathering confessions wrapped in laughter and wine. Their virtue made them invisible. Their smiles disarmed suspicion. And when Margaret uncovered too much, when she recognized the pattern beneath the charm, Jeremiah turned his most reliable solution: the treatments. The poisons disguised as care. The same strategy was applied again when Elena's questions grew too sharp, her gaze lingering too long on the walls. He relied on ignorance, on the limits of medicine, confident that no one would look beyond the diagnosis of a disturbed woman. But Don Carlos understood immediately. The documents spoke a language he knew well. This was not scandal, it was conspiracy, and more urgently, it was a death sentence waiting to be completed. His voice cut through the room like a blade as he declared that Elena would leave the house that very night, carrying the truth with her. The illusion of control shattered in that instant. He demanded accountability from the physician, demanding that medical judgment bow before evidence. Dr. Henley faltered, trapped between loyalty and conscience. Slowly, carefully, he admitted the truth aloud. If the papers were genuine, then both wives had been victims of intentional poisoning, their sanity sabotaged to mimic illness. Elena's recovery, he said, depended not on confinement, but on escape. On the poison leaving her body. The words hung in the air, heavy as smoke. Jeremiah's composure did not crack. His calm was almost rehearsed. He dismissed the evidence as fabrication, spun from delusion. He claimed the letters were fiction, the handwriting imitation, the poisons imaginary. He painted Elena as dangerously inventive, capable of building entire conspiracies from hallucination. It was a defense crafted long before this night. Don Carlos had anticipated every word. He countered with bottles drawn from his coat, the very compounds administered in secret. He spoke of chemists, of handwriting experts, of daylight scrutiny. And for the first time, the silence around Jeremiah felt uncertain. Then another voice rose. From the doorway stepped Sarah Quinn, her face, carved with years of restraint, finally breaking. She could no longer carry the weight of what she had seen. She spoke of two women reduced to shadows. She spoke of hands measuring doses, of footsteps moving through walls, of mirrors turned into instruments of terror. She swore Elena's story was truth, every dreadful word of it. She had watched the medicines prepared. She had watched the passages used. She had watched the bedroom become a laboratory of ruin. Her testimony sealed what documents alone could not. She confessed her role, her shame trembling in her voice. The bottles were unmarked, the deliveries private, the explanations always convincing. She described how the dosages increased, how isolation was enforced, how the bedroom became the center of decay. She described the identical patterns she saw repeating, like a curse replayed. The mirrors, the fear, the desperate attempts to explain the impossible. The worst part, she said, was watching them try to be believed. Margaret spoke of eyes in the walls, of strange tastes in her food, of reflections that moved too slowly, too knowingly. And each time the house swallowed her words and returned them as laughter, as pity, as dismissal. Nervous trouble, they called it, female weakness, a convenient lie. The room felt colder then, as though the mansion itself had recoiled. What had been hidden was now exposed, but the damage lingered, soaked into wood and glass and memory. This house had not driven its women mad by chance. It had been engineered to do so, and even as the truth emerged, the mirrors continued to watch, holding every confession in their depth. Because some houses remember what they were built for, and some truths, once spoken aloud, refused to stay silent. I knew, with a certainty that hollowed my chest, that something was terribly wrong the moment Mrs. Elena began recounting the same terrors, the same visions, the same whispered warnings that had once consumed Margaret. Patterns do not repeat themselves so perfectly by chance. As this realization took shape, Henley felt the ground shift beneath his professional standing. His name, once trusted, now trembled on the edge of disgrace as he understood how deeply he had been manipulated. The remedies he had authorized for pain and nerves had never reached their intended recipient. They had been quietly exchanged for poisons, slipped into teacups and tonics beneath the respectable mask of medical care. His diagnoses had become weapons, allowing Jeremiah to dismantle his wife's credibility while playing the role of the devoted husband enduring private sorrow. The doctor's composure fractured as the truth crystallized. He insisted on examining Elena at once, his voice, tight with urgency, explaining that prolonged exposure to hallucinogenic substances would leave traces, marks that science could no longer ignore. More than proof, he spoke of antidotes, of the possibility that her mind might still be rescued if action came swiftly. Yet even as the walls closed in, Jeremiah Hartwell revealed the chilling intellect that had carried him so far. He did not rage. He did not flee. He recalculated. With measured calm, he acknowledged part of what had been uncovered, offering a confession shaped to dull the blade of justice. Yes, he admitted, the house concealed passages. Yes, he had used them. He claimed they were relics of a former owner, tools inherited rather than conceived, instruments of observation meant solely for commerce. He framed his actions as strategic necessity, intelligence gathering that sharpened negotiations and secured advantage. The admission was precise, controlled, stopping just short of true culpability. He denied the poisons. He denied the plot. He suggested that both women had stumbled upon secrets they were never meant to see, and that the shock fractured their minds. He spoke of stress, of imagination turning inward, of fear breeding delusion. The medicines, he insisted, were harmless, merely ineffective against their unraveling thoughts. Margaret, he said, had grown convinced that every glance, every shadow, every silence was aimed at her. Elena, he claimed, had followed the same tragic path, constructing fantasies to explain what she could not accept. For a moment, the story hovered, almost plausible in its smoothness, but it collapsed under the weight of ink and paper. The letters from Dr. Zimmermann could not be dismissed. Their language was too exact, their descriptions too aligned with the suffering witnessed in that bedroom. Don Carlos refused to allow the truth to be diluted by clever phrasing. He declared that the courts would decide what was business and what was crime. Until then, Elena would leave the house, freed from its walls and from the hands that had poisoned her trust. As the confrontation edged toward its end, Elena, who had sat quietly as though listening to something unseen, lifted her head. When she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, unbroken by fear or confusion. She said the mirror woman had never left. She said the warnings had not stopped. But now, without the fog of medicine, she understood. The figure in the glass was not a ghost, not a trick of light, not madness made visible. It was herself, the part of her that had stayed awake while the rest of her mind was pushed into darkness. In that moment, the horror rearranged itself. The mirror woman had been a refuge, a compartment of clarity carved out by necessity. While chemicals dulled her senses and bent her perceptions, another version of her had watched, recorded, remembered. The conversations with the reflection were not hauntings but inner dialogues, a fractured mind trying desperately to preserve truth. What she had believed to be messages from elsewhere were memories returning piece by piece. She said she remembered everything now. Every murmur carried through the walls, every document glimpsed when her captor assumed her confusion made her harmless. Every letter, every ledger, every exchange that revealed the breadth of his dealings. The mirror had not fed her secrets. It had protected them, storing what her conscious mind could not hold. The days that followed rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. Don Carlos moved swiftly, delivering the evidence to authorities who could no longer look away. Henley documented Elena's recovery with meticulous care, his notes becoming proof that her condition had been manufactured, not born. As the poisons left her system, the fog lifted. The mirrors lost their pull. The visions dissolved. What remained was a woman restored, carrying a memory sharper than any blade. Her recollections became a map for investigators, tracing a network that reached far beyond the mansion. Hidden compartments yielded records of surveillance, coercion, and traded secrets that stained the reputations of powerful men. Judges, financiers, politicians, all bound together by information harvested in silence. The house on the hill was no longer merely a crime scene. It was the heart of corruption laid bare. As proceedings unfolded, it became clear that Jeremiah's greatest mistake had been underestimating the mind he tried to break. He believed poison could erase truth. Instead, it divided it, preserved it, and returned it whole. The mirrors that once reflected terror now stood empty, stripped of their power, yet still watching, still remembering, because houses like that do not forget what they have witnessed. And neither do the minds that survive them. The deeper the investigation cut, the more rot it exposed. What began as whispers of impropriety expanded into a ledger of corruption, revealing businessmen who had paid fortunes for secrets that could ruin rivals, topple careers, and bend entire markets to their will. In that widening circle of guilt, Margaret Hartwell's suffering finally found its true name. Her death was no longer a tragedy wrapped in misunderstanding. It was evident when her body was brought from the ground and examined with the most advanced methods the era could offer. The silence surrounding her fate was broken at last. Within her remains lingered the unmistakable traces of slow, deliberate poisoning, substances meant to erode the mind while preserving the appearance of fragile health had accumulated in her system over time. She had not succumbed to madness. She had been methodically destroyed. With that revelation, her passing was reclassified as murder, and Jeremiah Hartwell's careful mask fractured beyond repair. Records from the institution where Margaret had been confined painted an even darker portrait. Despite the fog imposed upon her, there had been moments when her thoughts were sharp, her words coherent, her warnings unwavering. Again and again, she insisted that her husband was poisoning her, that the house itself was part of a design meant to watch, record, and silence. Those statements, once dismissed as delusion, now read like testimony etched in desperation. Her sanity had flickered in intervals, just long enough to grasp the truth before chemicals dragged her back into confusion. Sarah Quinn's decision to step forward sealed what documents alone could not. Her years inside the household had given her a vantage point no outsider possessed. She spoke of routines, of timing, of medicines administered with ritual precision. She described how both women declined in eerily similar ways, how their symptoms rose and fell in step with the dosages Jeremiah controlled. Her words revealed that the poison did not end with the wives. Guests had left the house pale and shaken. Business associates had complained of strange sensations, of memory lapses, of unsettling dreams. The mansion had touched more lives than anyone had known. The man behind the chemicals was found soon after. Dr. Zimmerman was traced to Philadelphia, where he continued his experiments behind the respectable walls of a private asylum. His arrest unraveled a network far larger than a single house on a hill. Physicians and financiers, bound by secrecy and profit, had turned medicine into a weapon, using it to erase inconvenient women from public life. Newspapers named it the poisoning conspiracy, but the phrase failed to capture its true horror. It was not merely a plot, it was a system. Jeremiah Hartwell's trial transfixed the state. Courtrooms filled with spectators hungry for justice and fearful of what the revelations implied. Elena took the stand with a calm that commanded silence. She spoke of mirrors, of fractured thoughts, of a mind divided in order to survive. Sarah followed, her voice steady despite the weight of guilt she carried. Ledgers, letters, and hidden records were displayed, each piece tightening the noose. When Dr. Zimmerman testified in exchange for leniency, his clinical explanations stripped away any remaining doubt. He spoke of dosages designed to fracture perception without killing the body, of treatment crafted to mimic madness so convincingly that no one would look deeper. The defense attempted to cast Jeremiah as a pawn, a man misled by unscrupulous professionals. That illusion shattered when evidence showed he had sought out these methods, requested these effects, demanded solutions that would ruin a woman's credibility while keeping her alive long enough to be dismissed. The verdict came swiftly and without hesitation, guilty on every count. Murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, extortion. The sentence followed with brutal finality. Death by hanging. By the time the gallows were prepared, Elena's recovery was complete. Away from the house, away from the medicines, her mind returned to itself. She left Millbrook behind and found refuge in her father's home, eventually building a new life that bore no visible scars. Yet she never spoke of the mansion again beyond the words required by law. Some memories once faced are not meant to be revisited. The house itself did not escape judgment. Sold to settle debts, it was stripped of its secrets. Passages were sealed. Mirrors were taken down. Walls were altered until the master bedroom no longer resembled a chamber where truth had been fractured and hidden. Workers slept where confessions had once been whispered. But even altered, the structure carried a reputation that could not be erased. The impact of the case spread far beyond its walls. Laws were re-examined. Commitments to asylums faced new scrutiny. Independent evaluations became mandatory. The blind faith once placed in diagnosis began to erode. Conversations emerged about how easily women's voices had been dismissed, how readily their suffering had been labeled hysteria. Dr. Henley, haunted by his role, devoted his remaining years to understanding poisons that masquerade as illness. He became an advocate, insisting that women deserved care, not suspicion, respect, not confinement. Historians would later suggest that the Hartwell case was not unique. It was simply exposed. How many others had vanished behind diagnosis and locked doors, their truths buried beneath chemistry and convenience? How many houses had watched silently as knowledge was punished? The mirrors were gone, but the reflections remained, because some crimes do not end with justice. They linger, asking how many voices were never heard, and whether the walls around us are listening still. The final lesson left behind by the Hartwell case is not carved into stone alone. It lingers like a breath against the ear, urging us to listen when a voice trembles with fear. Margaret and Elena spoke of being watched, altered, quietly controlled, and their words were dismissed because they challenged comfort and convention. What sounded impossible was in truth an accurate map of the violence unfolding around them. Their terror was labeled illness, their clarity was called delusion, and that disbelief nearly erased them entirely. Today, the ground where the mansion once stood has been softened into grass and tree, a peaceful space that gives no hint of what once watched from behind walls. A small marker rests there, humble and unassuming, bearing names that were once whispered with doubt, and later spoken with reverence. It honors women who refused silence even as their realities were denied, and others whose suffering never found a witness. The stone does not shout, it does not accuse, it simply remembers. What happened within those walls reminds us how easily authority can become a weapon, how trust can be twisted into a tool of control, and how dangerous it is to dismiss someone simply because their truth unsettles us. Some horrors do not arrive with screams, they arrive softly, wrapped in respectability, asking only that no one ask questions. And so the story does not truly end. It lingers in the quiet spaces, in the pause after a confession, in the uneasy feeling that something is being left unsaid. Because even now there may be other voices unheard, waiting for someone willing to believe them. In the world of Gospel of the Haunted, the most terrifying ghosts are not spirits, they are truths ignored.